Hi, and welcome to Positive Psychology, where this week we're going to carry off where we left off. Do you remember? We're going to consider the defense mechanisms and coping strategies. And so these are the things that will help us with our self. Now, studies of self-regulation shows that better health and well-being occurs when certain types of coping strategies are used to manage our life challenges and certain types of defense mechanisms are adopted to manage anxiety when it's arising out of more difficult, conflicting, sexual, aggressive, or social motives. Now, there are emotion-focused coping strategies, such as fostering social support, which are appropriate for the uncontrollable stresses such as bereavement. For the more controlled stresses, problem-focused coping strategies are more appropriate. This is where things like timing out, that is, you take an active coping and it requires you to sort of take a break before returning to the active coping and avoiding coping such as distractions, which may be all appropriate. And we'll go through a variety of these. For all three coping styles, a distinction may be made between functional and dysfunctional. Again, we'll be reviewing all of that too. Now, the idea of coping strategies was developed within the cognitive behavioral tradition, cognitive behavioral thinking and the actions that we take, to explain the conscious management of situations in which external demands, now as a student an external demand could be an exam, and tax on our personal resources. And again, as a student, this could be such as your memory of the material being examined. Now, the concept of defense mechanisms, on the other hand, these evolved within the psychoanalytic tradition to explain how unconscious processes regulate anxiety associated with conflict between these unacceptable impulses, sexual or aggressive urges from the id, this is all Freud-based, and the prohibition of the conscious, or the superego. Now, in the Appendix B of the DSM-4 TR, now that's the classification manual for psychological disorders, there is, within the Appendix B, a defensive functioning scale, which is presented, which sort of presents the organization of defense mechanisms into 7 levels. And you'll see that in 7.2 in your text. Defenses at different levels regulate anxiety in different ways. At the adaptive level, defense regulates anxiety by allowing a balance to be achieved between unacceptable impulses and pro-social wishes. This balance maximizes the possibilities of gratification, coming out with good outcomes. Anticipation, affiliation, altruism, humor, self-assertion, self-observation, sublimation, and suppression. Now, these are examples of adaptive defenses. And over a lifetime, defenses follow a particular developmental trajectory from less sophisticated to more sophisticated. Now, both defense mechanisms and coping strategies are constructed which explain how we protect ourselves from being overwhelmed by strong negative emotions such as anxiety, sadness, and anger. However, there are important differences between the two constructs and the psychological processes which they refer. The idea of coping strategies was developed within, again, the cognitive behavioral tradition to explain how we consciously manage external demands along with the tax on our personal resources. Defense mechanisms are, on the other hand, much more unconscious, regulate negative, as I've mentioned already, and I'm repeating because it's an important distinction, regulate negative affect associated with interpsychic factors. Overall, evidence from intervention studies that have evaluated the effects of programs which aim to enhance a sense of personal control over physical and psychological difficulties shows that these interventions are beneficial. Defense mechanisms to review are unconscious. We don't think about them. They occur and come to our awareness. They regulate negative affect. They are associated with interpsychic conflicts. Now, again, this is Freud's theory, and you remember the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is the place where all these impulses and awarenesses come to our unconscious that we're not aware of, and we have to deal with those conflicts before they come out into our conscious awareness or into the social world where we need to navigate that. Now, this was all first described, this defense mechanism, by Freud. It is possible that you're familiar with the term defense mechanisms, but one note to make here: the defense mechanisms described in our text are not a complete list. There are hundreds of defense mechanisms. The most recent research that's been done by George Valiant on defense mechanisms, he arranged them into a series of highly adaptive, series of levels from dysfunctional to highly adaptive. And you'll see that in box 7.2. The highly adaptive level, there are 8 defense mechanisms. And I've already mentioned them, but I'm going to repeat them because I want to walk you through just basically what they mean. Anticipation, affiliation, altruism, humor, self-assertion, self-observation, sublimation, and suppression. Now, these are highly adaptive defenses that regulate anxiety and maximize the possibility of gratification by transforming anxiety arising from conflict between these unacceptable impulses into more positive actions. Now, there are less adaptive defenses. And the less adaptive defenses regulate anxiety by keeping impulses and injunctions out of the consciousness, distorting the image of self and others, and acting out of negative impulses. Now, I'll briefly look at the adaptive defense mechanisms that are in 7.4, figure 7.4 in your e-text. And we're going to go through these ones, as I mentioned, just to get a little bit of an understanding of them. So, anticipation. Now, anticipation is considering and the partial experiencing of emotional reactions and the consequences of these emotions before the conflict or stress occurs, and exploring the various solutions to these problematic states. So it's anticipating and planning for, so there's no surprises. Affiliation. This is where the others become so important. Affiliation is seeking social support from others, sharing the problems with them, and doing this without making them responsible for the problem. Altruism is a dedication to meeting the needs of others and receiving gratification from just that activity without engaging in excessive self-sacrifice. We do it out of the goodness of our heart, and it doesn't leave a mark. Humor, reframing situations that give us rise to conflict or stress in an ironic or somehow amusing way. Self-assertion, expressing conflict-related thoughts or feelings in a direct yet non-coercive way. And sublimation is channeling negative emotions that arise from conflict into socially acceptable activities. Getting involved in work and putting your head down and working hard, or getting involved in sports, or doing an art piece. Suppression is intentionally avoiding the intentional avoidance of thinking about conflict for a brief period. You're parking it over here, and we'll all get to it in a minute, but you don't ignore it. You do go back to it. That's important. Assessing these defense mechanisms via self-reports and rating scales produce limited data on particularly adaptive mechanisms. Now, there's a reason for why we maybe don't have much data on the adaptive. More data on maladaptive defense mechanisms is largely due to that's the only mechanisms that were really known for some time. It wasn't until Gallant's work was somewhat more groundbreaking to look at the more adaptive and more positive defense mechanisms. The one rating scale that we will look at is the Defense Mechanism Rating Scale, which allows for 27 defenses or defense mechanisms to be rated from interview recordings. Defenses are grouped into 7 levels. The first level being mature defenses, and those are the ones we're going to go through. That's affiliation, altruism, anticipation, and so on. Then there's second level, which is the obsessional defenses, and this involves when we engage in isolation, intellectualization, and undoing. The third level, other neurotic defenses. This is repression, dissociation, reaction formation, and displacement. The fourth level, minor image distortion, narcissistic defenses. Fifth level, disavowal defenses, denial, projection, rationalization, fantasy. The sixth level is major image distorting borderline defenses, that's splitting and projective identification. And then the seventh level is action defenses, acting out, passive aggression, and hypochondrias. The rating scales have criteria for rating the presence or the absence of defenses. Now, should you want to try something to work on and use for an adaptive defense mechanism, try this. Make a point of noticing a situation in which you start to be aware of an internal conflict between an unacceptable impulse or an emotion and a wish not to express that impulse or emotion. When you notice this conflict, pause before reacting. Consider using one of the highly adaptive mechanisms, defense mechanisms. Those are the anticipation, affiliation. By pausing and taking a moment to review, you are doing anticipation. Write down the adaptive defenses that you used to do this, and then rate them from 1 to 10 as to how effective was it in helping you with the internal conflict. And this is a process, so this shouldn't be just done once. This is something you would do frequently whenever those conflicts emerge. Okay, now the next area that we're going to explore are coping strategies. And as a quick review, coping strategies are a conscious process. These are the ones we use our head to think. For dealing with external demands, as I mentioned earlier, the external demands for a student might be exams and assignments. It's not dealing with the internal intrapsychic conflict. They are used when the demands on our personal resources are demanding. And they're introduced into modern psychology within the cognitive behavior tradition, and they are distinct from defense mechanisms. Coping strategies may be classified into one of a couple of ways. Either they're problem-focused, where the aim is to reduce stresses. It's useful for controllable, manageable stresses. Emotion-focused, well, its aim is to reduce stress response to the more uncontrollable stresses. Avoidant aim, which is the third, is to avoid sources of stress useful in the short term only. Now, coping strategies may be classified as either functional, which lead to long-term well-being, or dysfunctional, which lead to short-term well-being, but not long-term increases in stress. So the diagram on the slide that I'm putting up there is a model of the coping process. It's figure 7.5 in your e-text. We respond to challenging life events like going to college or university for the first time by appraising or evaluating the demands that this places upon us, and then coping with these demands using functional or dysfunctional strategies. We may evaluate the demands positively and use functional coping strategies, attending lectures, studying well, making friends. These all enhance well-being. But, as you might expect, we may appraise the demands as exceeding personal resources, and we might use dysfunctional coping strategies like we might isolate ourselves. We might procrastinate doing things that need to be done, like assignments, or we might drink too much, which in the short term may reduce the immediate negative effect on but it doesn't have a good positive effect on well-being. The cognitive process of appraisal influences how the body reacts at a neurobiological level, and ultimately how stress impacts our health. This process of coping with transitory demands and life events is influenced by the support that we get from friends and family, the supportive relationships, the environmental system like financial difficulties or the supportive relationship that we're in, the personal system, which would be our personality traits and self-efficacy. Now we can look at the functional problem-based coping strategies to get a handle on what we may want to try. Now that's in box 7.3. To be engaged in functional, focused coping strategies, first we need to see what is the foundation of these strategies. And the first is, and this is most important with any problem, first is accepting responsibility for solving the problem. If the problem is mine, it's mine to solve. It isn't anybody else's. So I need to take responsibility. Then I'm going to start seeking accurate information about the problem. Because maybe the problem has only been in my head and I know that thoughts are not facts. So I need to find reliable and accurate information. Then seeking dependable advice and help. Then developing a realistic action plan. And then follow out that action plan, either alone or with the support of other people. So remember, staying focused in postponing or engaging in competitive activities. Then lastly, maintaining an optimistic view of one's capacity to solve the problem. Dysfunctional problems focus coping on basically the opposite of functional. That just makes sense. Sometimes the stresses that we may experience are uncontrollable, and that's where the emotion-focused coping strategies are the most appropriate. These are different from problem-focused strategies. And I'm going to summarize some of the functional, emotional-focused coping strategies. The first strategy in emotion-focused would be social support, engaging in close, confiding relationships. Second would be catharsis. It's the processing of emotionally charged thoughts and memories within the context of confiding in a confiding relationship, or even by writing in a journal. Seeking meaningful spiritual or religious support which provides long-term membership of a socially supportive community and encourages a balanced moral and provides meaning and purpose in life. Positive interpretation of challenging situations through benefit finding, taking an ironic or humorous perspective, finding meaning or purpose in life by facing adversity. Post-traumatic growth, which involves 5 processes: recognition of personal strength, improved relationship with other people, greater appreciation of life, spiritual and existential transportation, and an increased openness to new possibilities. Now, meaningful work, or that's paid, or even voluntary work within the context of a balanced life are all beneficial for emotion focused problem solving, emotion focused. So within that emotion focused coping, I'd like to add to your understanding of the functional versus dysfunctional approach. And we're going to look at a principle that I've labeled pain pleasure principle. And it goes like this. Sometimes problems that we have are because we settle for short-term pleasure and accept the long-term pain, which is the dysfunctional. Instead, we can aim for short-term pain and gain long-term pleasure, functional. So a couple of things. Do these things sound a bit familiar? You know, some days you might commit to a diet and then you find yourself eating a chunk of chocolate, which you later regret because it doesn't feel so good. Or maybe you had something to tell a coworker that you didn't really want to have to say, but you had to, and it was uncomfortable, and you chose not to do it, and all you did was worry about it. These are examples of short-term pleasure and long-term pain. It's pleasurable, short-term, to eat chocolate or put off an uncomfortable task. However, we later lament our decision, long-term pain. Many of us are motivated by this combination of pain and pleasure. Short-term pleasure can be comfortable. Long-term pain can be representative of fear of change or what change may mean, like giving up something you might like. A strategy for change is to seize the principle, recognize your use of the short-term pleasure, long-term pain pattern, and then consider how you will change this from short-term pain to long-term pleasure. That pattern is much better. In this healthier pattern, the short-term pain is representing our moving from what is familiar and comfortable and more to something that is more healthier and more rewarding. In order to complete this positive pattern more successfully, we need to develop our long-term pleasure more fully in a manner that draws us toward it more so than remaining the same. So when I say more fully, I mean consider what it would look like in the long term to have this new long-term pleasure. Not only what would it look like, what would it feel like, what would it sound like? Imagine having it. Visualize it. The point is to further enhance what it is that we want, therefore minimizing or diminishing the short-term value of staying the same. When we do this, we continually, on a daily basis, remind ourselves of our long-term pleasure. We can remain focused and reinforced for what we are doing and what value we are moving to and what it provides us. By proceeding in this manner, we are accepting the minor inconvenience of the short-term pain of change and are more mindful of the long-term pleasure we are achieving. As with our well-being assignment, our use of goals and strengths, gratitude, hope, and optimism, perhaps with some nurturing of our positive self, we can begin to feel more well-being and positive view ahead. I hope you have gained something from this chapter on positive self. The next 2 weeks we'll be exploring positive relationships. So we'll see you then, and good luck. Bye now.